The night Garrett Holt went out searching for the girl he'd decided to discard, the only ones who knew where she was hiding were 9 years old. Hold that picture. A grown man, his own land, his own lantern, 44 years of living in hard country behind him, moving from woodshed to root cellar to corral in the dark, looking everywhere a person might take shelter, calling no name because he'd never used hers. And 2 children who barely came up to his shoulder had already handled the situation. Had already decided, with the clarity that children sometimes possess and adults have mostly managed to lose, exactly what was owed to this girl and what they were willing to do about it. Whether that night embarrassed Garrett Holt is something I'll get to. But to understand why it cracked open what it cracked open in a man who had spent the better part of a year making sure nothing could, you have to go back 4 weeks. To the morning a supply wagon turned off the main track and began climbing through the pines toward the Holt homestead. To the morning Nora Callan arrived. November came hard to the Bitterroot country in 1878. The ridgelines above the homestead had taken their first serious snow before the month was a week old, not the polite, melting kind, but the kind that settles in and means it, that rearranges the look of the mountains and reminds you without sentiment that this land sets the schedule, not you. The air at elevation had the quality of a blade. Not cruel, exactly. Just precise. Nora had done her crying over 2 nights in the valley below, quietly, while her father slept. By the time the wagon was climbing through the pines and the homestead appeared through a break in the timber, her face held nothing that could be easily read. That was a thing she'd learned young, that composure was a resource, and she'd learned early to guard it. Her father, Nora Callan, was the man beside her on the bench. He was not a villain. I want to say that plainly, because it would be simpler if he were, simpler and considerably less honest. He was a man who had taken 3 years of bad harvests and a debt he couldn't service and had eventually looked at his circumstances and his daughter and arrived at what he called a practical arrangement. The figure was $40, cleared against what he owed Garrett Holt from a crop loan the summer prior. He'd explained to Nora that the Holt place was solid and established, that the man was a widower who needed someone to run the household and tend to his children, that she'd be sheltered and working in conditions far better than what the valley could offer her now. He said all of it without looking at her. Which told her more than the words did. The homestead settled into view through the last gap in the timber, a main cabin, long and low, with wood smoke rising straight from the chimney in the still air, a barn of gray weathered boards, a root cellar mounded with frozen earth, a woodshed. A corral where 2 horses stood hipshot with their backs to the wind. Behind all of it, the mountain slope climbed dark with pine and cedar, and the sky above the ridge sat flat and pale, the color of old pewter. A man stood at the corral fence. He had the posture of someone paid to handle inconvenient things and long since accustomed to it. When the wagon stopped, he came forward and introduced himself as Pelham, said in a flat, civil voice that Mr. Holt had asked him to show the young woman to the house. Nora climbed down. The frozen ground was solid under her boots, no give, no creak, just the hard fact of deep cold underfoot. She turned back once, not to say anything, only to look, at her father sitting on the wagon bench with his hands wrapped around the reins and his gaze pointed somewhere between the horse's ears. She picked up her canvas bag. She followed Pelham toward the cabin. She did not look back again. Garrett Holt was visible for exactly 1 moment. He stood in the open doorway of the barn, a large man, broad through the chest and shoulders, wearing a dark wool coat, and he watched the wagon, and then he watched Pelham lead the girl toward the cabin, and then he turned and walked back into the dark interior of the barn. That was the whole of the introduction. No greeting. No acknowledgement. The transaction had been conducted at the level where he'd approved it. The logistics were Pelham's concern. The twins were at the corral fence. Both of them, in their winter coats, watching. They were 9 years old and close enough in feature to bring a stranger up short. 10 minutes with them dissolved that confusion permanently. The boy, Eli, watched Nora with the fixed, patient attention of a child who has formed a working theory and is measuring the evidence against it. The girl, Wren, had her eyes on the departing wagon. Is that your pa? Ren asked. Yes, Nora said. He ain't staying? No. Ren chewed on this, her chin resting on the top rail of the fence. She had the manner of a child who has absorbed a number of hard things in her short life and become direct as a result. Our ma didn't stay either, she said, matter of fact as weather. She got sick in March. Died in June. That's different, I reckon. Different from your situation. Nora looked at the girl, at her steady dark eyes, the matter-of-fact set of her mouth. Yes, she said. That's different. Eli, who had not spoken, gave Nora one slow, considering nod. The kind that means, I'm still deciding. But so far you're all right. The room Pelham showed her was small, clean, and still in the way of rooms that have been waiting. A quilt folded at the foot of the bed. A washstand. A trunk with its latch worn smooth from years of use. Nora set her bag on the floor and understood within one careful look that this had been someone else's room, and recently. The quilt had been folded with deliberate care, not stored. A woman's comb sat on the washstand with 3 dark hairs still caught in the teeth. The trunk, when she lifted the latch, held a wool dress, 2 cotton blouses, a pair of knitted gloves, a small tin of dried lavender. Everything folded flat and precise, as though its owner expected to return for it. She closed the trunk gently. She sat on the edge of the bed. Through the small window, the wood smoke from the barn rose straight in the windless air. The mountain above was already losing its definition in the long gray afternoon. She sat with her hands in her lap and turned the situation over until she'd looked at every face of it. She was in this house as a replacement for something that couldn't be replaced, brought here by a man who was already walking away through the cold to the barn, resented before she'd spoken a word or done a single thing wrong. That was the situation. She took it apart and put it back together. Then she got up and went to see what the kitchen needed. Garrett Holt came to supper that first evening and sat at the head of the table and ate without speaking. He was imposing at close range, those heavy working hands, the jaw set in the arrangement of a man who has decided that silence is a form of control. He did not look directly at Nora. He ate what she'd cooked and did not comment, which she noted as neither rudeness nor approval, simply the baseline of this household, where things done were expected and things expected were not remarked upon. The twins sat across from her. Ren's fork paused every time something occurred to her, which was often. Eli ate with steady attention, watching everything without making a performance of it. When supper was done, Garrett pushed back his chair and looked at Nora for the first time, brief, direct, the way a man checks a fence line to see whether it'll hold. Then, breakfast before first light. He was gone. Eli collected his plate and carried it to the wash basin. Unhurried. On his way past Nora, without breaking stride or making anything of it, he gave her one small, definite nod. The kind that means, I see you're still standing. Good. The next morning, before the light was fully up, Nora went to the woodpile beside the cabin door and found it stacked taller than she'd left it, taller than she could have managed herself, and done with a precision that meant business, every log placed for drainage, the whole structure solid and close. Work done in the dark, before anyone was awake to see it. The smell of pine sap was sharp in the cold air. She could hear Eli moving inside the barn, his boots on the frozen boards. She went in and started the fire. Said nothing about it. Some things don't need to be named to be understood. It was the 3rd week of November when Garrett Holt came to find her in the kitchen. The twins were at their lessons. Pelham was working the south slope. Nora was at the table. She heard his boots in the hall, that specific weight of step, unhurried, decided, and then he was in the doorway with his hat in his hands, and the way he stood made clear he hadn't come for anything ordinary. He said it plainly, the way he said most things, without preparation, without softening, as though the sentence had been sitting in him for some time and he'd finally decided to let it out. Come the first hard freeze, Pelham will take you down to the settlement. There's a boarding house there. Widow woman runs it. You'll find work. Nora set down what she was holding. She kept her eyes on the table. The fire in the hearth was the only sound in the kitchen. Did I do something wrong? She said. Not quite a question. No, he said. He put his hat on. He left. Nora stood at the kitchen window and watched him cross the yard toward the barn in the fading copper light, his coat dark against the pale sky, his stride even and uninterrupted, a man who had delivered a ruling he considered final. She pressed her palm flat against the glass. She held it there until the cold had pulled all the warmth out of her hand. Until there was nothing left to give the window. Then she turned back to the table and went on with what she'd been doing, because there was nothing else to do. The morning after Garrett's announcement, Nora began preparing to leave. She didn't storm through the house, and she didn't go quiet in a way meant to make anyone feel her distress. She opened the small room, set Clara's trunk carefully to one side, and repacked her canvas bag with the same methodical attention she'd brought to everything since arriving. There was a pair of wool stockings she'd darned with thread from the sewing basket. She set them on top of the trunk. They weren't hers. Wren found her at it. The girl appeared in the doorway in mid-morning with her coat half-buttoned and her dark hair loose and the expression she wore when she'd already concluded something and was present only to confirm it. She looked at the bag. She looked at Nora. She came fully into the room and sat on the edge of the bed without any invitation. "You're packing," Wren said. "Yes." "Because he told you to go." "Yes." "And you're just going to go?" She said it the way she said everything that needed saying, flat, without decoration. It wasn't an observation. It was a charge. Nora stopped what she was doing. She sat on the trunk and looked at the girl across from her. At this 9-year-old who had lost her mother in June and had spent the fall watching another woman move through the house her mother kept, and had, in that particular way that children sometimes do, already made a decision about it. "Wren," she said. "It's not my house." "It ain't entirely his either," Wren said. "Not entirely. It was Ma's too. And she ain't here to say what she'd want." The fire in the hearth settled. Outside, the wind moved through the tops of the pines in a long, even sound. "I can't stay if your father won't have me," Nora said. It was the full truth of her situation. What she hadn't yet understood was that the situation was no longer entirely in Garrett's hands. Wren looked at her for a long, level moment. Then she got up and left without another word. Not slamming the door. Just gone, with the particular departure of a child who has decided something and is going to go do it. That evening, after supper, Eli went to his father. Garrett was at the table with the supply ledger, tracking numbers by the coal oil lamp the way he did most evenings, methodical, absorbed, a man who found steadiness in columns and the concrete fact of what things cost. Eli came and stood across the table and waited. That was his way. Garrett looked up. "She don't want to go," Eli said. Garrett turned back to the ledger. "That ain't the point." "Then what is the point?" "Even. Patient." With the genuine expectation of an honest answer, which was the most unsettling thing about the boy. He actually believed he'd get one. Garrett set his pen down. He looked at his son, at this boy who had his mother's mouth and his mother's habit of walking straight at the thing no one else would approach. Something crossed his face. The kind of expression a man makes when something has pressed against an interior wall he's built carefully and doesn't intend to examine. "Go to bed, Eli." A beat. Eli turned and walked back down the hall. He didn't slam the door. He just pulled it shut quietly behind him. That was Eli's way, no performance, no dramatics. Just the quiet, final click of a door closed by someone who knows the conversation isn't over, even if the other person believes it is. Garrett sat at the table for a long time after the lamp in the hall went dark. He went out eventually, the way he did every night, coat on, lantern lit, a circuit of the barn and the outbuildings before turning in. The cold had deepened in the past several days, pressing down from the high country, settling into the yard with a permanence that meant the freeze was close. He was crossing toward the barn when he stopped. He held the lantern up. He looked at the right cuff of his coat, the one that had been working loose at the seam since August, catching on things, letting the cold find the gap. He'd noted it the way a man notes small deteriorations he doesn't yet have time for, filed it, intended to see to it eventually, and had been ignoring it for 3 months. The seam had been resewn. He could see it in the lantern light, small, even stitches, worked in thread the same deep brown as the wool itself. Near invisible. Tighter than the original. Solid. He hadn't asked anyone to do it. He hadn't mentioned it to anyone. It was the kind of task that exists below the threshold of asking, the kind of small failure that a person living alongside others either quietly fixes or quietly leaves alone. She had not left it alone. He stood in the yard with the lantern's circle of orange light on the frozen ground, and he flexed his hand inside the sleeve and felt the cuff hold firm. He stood there long enough that his breath made a small cloud in front of him that the cold air took apart. Then he went on to the barn, did his checks, and went inside. He told himself he wasn't going to think about the coat. He thought about it anyway. The hard freeze arrived in the first week of December. Not with warning. Just a drop in temperature so decisive overnight that the mud at the yard's edge became stone before morning. The water barrel near the barn froze solid to within 6 inches of the surface. By midday, ice had formed at the edges of the stream in the lower timber, and by nightfall the pass above the homestead had taken on the particular sealed quality that meant it wouldn't open again until March. Pelham confirmed it at supper, the way he delivered all information, without unnecessary words. He'd ridden to the tree line. The track down through the pines was still passable, but only for another day or two before the ice and fallen snow from the upper slope closed it entirely. If the young woman was going to the settlement, it had to be first thing in the morning. Garrett nodded. Said nothing. Nora served the meal. She ate. She cleared the plates and put the kitchen in good order, the same careful order she'd kept every night since arriving, and then she went to the small room and finished what she'd started packing. The twins went to bed. Garrett banked the fire. The homestead went dark and quiet, and the cold pressed against every wall of it. Garrett was up before first light, as always. He dressed in the cold dark. He came out to the main room to stir the fire and stopped. The bench where Wren left her boots every night, empty. The peg where Eli hung his coat before bed, bare. He stood in the cold room and looked at these absences for a moment. Then he went to the hall and pushed open the door to the twins' room. 2 made beds. Both empty, the quilts drawn up with the neat precision of children who did not want to appear hurried. He went to the small room at the end of the hall. He pushed the door open. The canvas bag was gone. The room was empty. Clara's trunk sat undisturbed at the foot of the bare bed. On top of it, a pair of wool stockings, folded. The ones Nora had darned and left behind because they were not hers. Garrett stood in the doorway with one hand on the frame. He understood, in the slow settling way of certainty, what must have happened. He didn't know where. Only that his children had been deliberate about it. He took the lantern off the wall. He put on his coat. He went out into the black pre-dawn, into cold so precise it cut clean into the lungs, and he began to look. The root cellar first, the heavy door hauled up, the lantern held down into the earthen dark, the smell of stored turnips and dried onion rising from below. Empty. The woodshed, the door pushed through into the sharp smell of split pine and sawdust. Every corner swept with the lantern. Nothing but stacked cord and an axe leaning against the wall. The corral, he walked the fence line, the 2 horses shifting toward him in the dark, their breath rising in pale columns beside his own. He checked the lean-to at the corral's far end. Nothing. He crossed the frozen yard toward the barn. The ground under his boots gave no sound, not a creak, not a shift. The mountain above was a mass of darker dark against a sky beginning, far to the east, to show the faintest gray. The wind came down off the high country with a sound like something very large, breathing slowly. He reached the barn. He put his hand on the door. He pulled it open and raised the lantern. They were in the far corner of the haymow. Wren and Eli had built something between a fort and a nest, every spare blanket from the cedar chest in the hall, the old horse blanket from the tack wall, the extra quilt from the main room, all of it layered around Nora with the thoroughness of children who had thought this through and intended it to work. Nora sat at the center of it wrapped in the gray wool blanket from her room, her dark hair loose around her shoulders, her canvas bag beside her. She was looking at Garrett. Eli sat to her left, his back straight. He had pressed his finger to his lips when the door began to move, a reflex, and now he slowly lowered his hand. His jaw was set. He did not look away from his father. Wren had her arm across Nora's back, sitting upright the way she sat when she'd arrived at a position and intended to hold it. Nora did not flinch. She did not drop her eyes. She looked at Garrett Holt, the man who had arranged her purchase and declined to acknowledge her arrival and then ordered her removed, and she looked at him with weeks of held composure behind her face and no apology in any part of it. The lantern threw amber light across the hay and the wool and the three faces looking back at him. Nobody moved. The mountain wind came through the pines outside. The cold pushed past Garrett and into the barn. He stood in the doorway and stood there, and none of them moved, and the silence was not comfortable, it was a kind of statement, and all four of them could read it. That silence in the barn ran long enough to become its own kind of event. Garrett stood with the lantern, and the three of them looked back at him, and nobody spoke for what felt like the better part of a full minute. In my experience, a silence that long between people who have something to say is never actually empty. It's full of things circling, looking for the way in. Eli found the way. He didn't argue. He didn't make a case the way Wren would have, full-throated, with momentum. Eli knew his father. He knew that Garrett Holt's defenses were built against speeches and against sentiment and against the kind of direct emotional appeal that fathers normally have to navigate. What Eli offered instead was something Garrett had no prepared wall against. A fact. Small and specific and undeniable. "Pa," he said. His voice was quiet. "Even. She mended your coat. The cuff on the right side, the seam that was pulling loose since summer. She did it when nobody asked her to." Garrett's eyes moved to his right cuff. A reflex, involuntary, immediate. "You never thanked her for it either," Eli added. "Not as a condemnation. As the rest of the fact." Wren, who had been sitting with her arm across Nora's back like a small, decided wall, looked up at her father. Her expression was the one she wore when she had thought something completely through and had no interest in softening the conclusion. "You can send her away if you want," Wren said. "But then you have to tell us why. Not because she did something wrong. Not because there ain't room. The real reason." The lantern flame moved in a breath of cold air from the open door. Garrett looked at his daughter. He looked at his son. He looked at Nora, this girl sitting in his haymow wrapped in every blanket his children could carry, sold by her own father to settle a $40 debt, ordered from his house by a man she'd never wronged, who had spent weeks in a dead woman's room keeping that woman's kitchen and mending a coat no one had asked her to touch. He looked at her, and she looked back, and neither of them looked away. He didn't answer Wren's question. He bent and set the lantern down on the barn floor. He straightened. He stood there for another long moment, that low, internal shift of something that has been rigid too long and has begun, at last, to move. Then he walked out of the barn without a word. Back across the frozen yard. Into the house. The door closed behind him. The three of them remained still for a moment. Then Nora pushed back the blankets and got to her feet, stiffly, carefully, her body cold through. She reached down for her canvas bag. She helped Wren up and took Eli's hand, and the three of them walked across the dark yard toward the house. The kitchen lamp was lit. At the table, where 4 places were set every meal and only 3 were ever used, Garrett had placed a 4th setting. A plate. A cup. A fork and a knife, laid parallel. He was nowhere in the kitchen. His boots were on the rack in the hall. He had gone to bed. Nora stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the 4th place for a long time. The lamp burned steady on the table. The banked fire gave the room its warmth, and the smell of wood smoke hung low and close. She set her canvas bag down in the corner. She added a small piece of wood to the fire. She sat in the chair before the 4th plate, and Eli sat to one side of her and Wren to the other, and they stayed there in the warm kitchen until the cold had worked itself completely out of their bones. Nobody spoke of it in the morning. Garrett came to breakfast before first light as he always did and sat in his chair and ate what Nora had cooked. Wren described a dream that had featured a horse with strong opinions about the management of the corral. Eli noted that this was not how horses generally worked. Wren maintained that the horse in the dream had been quite specific on several key points and deserved to be taken seriously. The argument occupied several minutes without resolution, which was typical. The gray December light came in through the kitchen window and lay across the table and the 4 of them sitting around it. When Garrett pushed back his chair to go, he paused. He looked in Nora's direction, not precisely at her, but toward her, a fraction closer than the wall he'd been maintaining. "Water barrel near the barn will freeze solid by noon," he said. "I'll break it out this morning. Don't trouble yourself with it." "All right," Nora said. He nodded. He put on his coat, the mended coat, and went out. Wren waited until the door closed. Then she looked at Nora across the table with an expression of complete satisfaction. Nora picked up her cup and looked out the window at the pale morning and did not smile, exactly, but some hardness at the edges of her face went quiet, the way a river finds its level after a long run of rough ground. The weeks that followed were not transformation. I want to be honest about that. Garrett Holt was not remade overnight into something easier. That is not how a man like him worked, and this story is too honest to pretend otherwise. He was still quiet where he'd been quiet. Still the kind of man who communicated through practicalities and left the rest of life mostly unremarked. But the 4th place stayed set. He began asking Nora the location of things, the axe oil, the good tin of harness wax, the spare tack buckles. Questions he could have answered himself with 10 minutes of looking. Each one a small piece of traffic between them, building something word by careful word in the way that cautious people sometimes do, through the ordinary, through the useful, through the undramatic fact of sharing the same days. Eli stopped pausing in the hallway at night. He had been doing that, his footsteps going quiet outside doors, a child making sure the house held together. He stopped. He slept through. Wren brought Nora things, a piece of striped quartz from the creek bed, a crow feather, a small drawing of the horses rendered with great conviction if not exact accuracy, a dried wildflower she'd found pressed in a book and couldn't identify but felt strongly about. Nora placed each of these things on the windowsill of her room in a careful line. They stayed there. The line grew. It was in January, working through the kitchen stores on a gray mid-afternoon, that Nora opened the back of the sideboard drawer and found the letter. Folded in thirds, on plain paper, the paper of ordinary people who didn't write often. The handwriting was careful, practiced into legibility but never made into a craft. Nora stood at the open drawer and read it through twice before she fully understood what she was holding. The letter was addressed to no particular family, to any family in the valley below that might have a daughter willing to come when the time came. It explained that Clara Holt of the Upper Bitterroot was ill, and did not expect to be well into the following winter, and that she had 2 young children who would need a woman in the house when she was gone, and a husband who she knew would not ask for help from anyone, but who might, if the arrangement were made before it became necessary, accept it. She wrote that the property was solid, the work was hard, and the man was decent when he wasn't drowning in things he didn't know how to carry, which she acknowledged was most of the time lately, but that she had every faith he would find his way back if he was given something worth finding it for. The letter ended, "I ask only that whoever comes be treated with the same regard I would have wished for myself in her place. She will be far from her own people. She deserves a home, not just a place to sleep." Nora read it once more. Then she stood in the quiet kitchen with the coal oil lamp burning low and the smell of wood smoke settling around her and understood the shape of things she hadn't been able to see before. Clara had written this letter from her sickbed, had looked ahead from that diminished and frightening place to what would come after her, and had arranged for someone to come. And Garrett had found the letter after his wife was gone, had lived with the knowledge that she had done this, had felt the weight of it, the resentment of it, the unbearable tenderness of it, and had brought Nora here because Clara asked him to, and had spent the first weeks trying to send her away because keeping her meant accepting what his wife had known was coming. Every time he looked at Nora, he saw the evidence of everything Clara had prepared for. The letter had been in this drawer since before Nora arrived. He had put it where she would eventually find it. He had chosen not to say it in words, because he was a man who could not say things in words, but he had placed the truth in the drawer she used every day and had waited. Nora folded the letter along its original creases. She took the same care with it that she took with everything that mattered. She placed it back exactly where she had found it. She closed the drawer. She never mentioned it to Garrett. Not then, and not after. There are things between people that don't require words to become real, that settle in and are understood in the background of ordinary life, informing everything without ever being stated. This was one of them. Spring came late to the Bitterroot country, the way it always did at elevation, reluctantly, by degrees, testing the air before committing. In the last week of March, the south-facing slope above the homestead showed the first dark earth through the snow, a thin stripe of it along the ridge where the afternoon sun hit longest, then wider, until by the last days of the month there was a full band of bare ground, dark soil, wet from the melt, smelling of pine and cold mud and the green of everything that had been waiting underground since November. Nora saw it from the kitchen window. She'd opened it a crack, enough to let the new air in, the first air in months that carried something other than cold. She stood at the window and let the smell of it come to her, pine sap, wet earth, the faint green suggestion of everything waking beneath. The twins were at the corral fence. Wren had invented a game involving thrown sticks and a counting system that shifted mid-round whenever the count wasn't going her way. Eli was contesting the rules with the patient precision of a person who believes in consistent standards and intends to hold the line regardless of the social cost. Their voices carried clear and bright in the cold morning air. Garrett was at the woodpile, splitting cord for next winter, the same forward-looking practicality he brought to every necessary thing. The axe rose and fell in a steady rhythm, and the sound of it crossed the yard in even intervals, and the split wood stacked clean and pale beside him. Then he stopped. He set the axe against the splitting block. He looked up, not at the slope, not at the sky, not at the twins at the fence. At the window. At her. Nora did not step back from the glass. Garrett did not look away. It lasted the length of a slow breath held and then let go, just that, just the two of them across the yard and the cold bright air between them, looking at each other without the wall entirely up on his side or the bracing on hers. Then he reached for the axe. He went back to work. Nora stayed at the window. Below her, Wren was loudly revising the rules of the stick game. Eli was not having it. The creek in the lower timber was running again, she could hear it faintly, carried on the right kind of air. The dark earth was spreading slowly down the slope, taking back what winter had covered. She stayed. That was the whole of it. And it was enough. Stories like Nora's don't close the way we want them to. No proclamation in the kitchen at supper, no neat unwinding of everything that came before. What there is instead is truer, a fourth place kept at a table, a letter folded back along its crease, a look held one breath longer than nothing across a yard in early spring. If something in this story stayed with you today, if you found yourself somewhere in Nora's endurance, or in the way those two children decided she was worth protecting before any adult in the room did, carry it with you. And if you've been watching these stories with me week after week, you already know what we're building here. There are more lives like this one. I'll see you at the next one.